Just a word of caution, this podcast does contain material related to sexual assault, which could be upsetting to some listeners. Please make sure you're emotionally resourced and seek help from a trauma specialist or medical professional if you need it.
When it comes to sexual assault, when it comes to, any kind of violence, it's easier for bystanders to do nothing.
Tell it to me straight, don't leave out a word, don't leave out anything you think I should have heard.
Hi, and welcome to Slut or Nut, the podcast. I'm Kelly Shoker, and I'm the director of Slut or Nut, The Diary of a Rape Trial, which is a feature-length documentary film exploring what it is like to report rape and following activist Mandi Gray as she fights to change how victims of sexual assault are treated by the criminal justice system. You can also find the show notes related to this episode on our site and more episodes of Slut or Nut the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and on our website at www.slutornut.ca. And if you'd like to share your own story of sexual assault, gender-based violence, or your expertise on the legal system or trauma related to sexual assault, and you'd like to be a guest on our podcast, please email us at slutornutthemovie@gmail.com. We took a quick break for the holidays, but now we are back, and today I am talking to Roslyn Talusan. You might recognize Rosalyn and her story from the film Slut or Nut, The Diary of a Rape Trial, because she is featured in the film, and you see her during the Rapenomics protest. And we have exciting news about Slut or Nut, the movie, as well. We are screening this next week in Austria at the Plit Film Festival in Innsbruck, and then also at the Reframe Film Festival in Canada at the end of the month. And then that will be the end of our festival tour. And after that, on February 19th, Slut or Nut is going to be released in the US, UK, Canada, and worldwide on streaming platforms. So you'll be able to watch it on Amazon, Amazon Prime, iTunes, Vimeo, all of the streaming platforms, YouTube rentals, all the streaming platforms that you have access to. So without further ado, we're going to get into hearing from Roslyn.
So my name is Roslyn Talusan. I was born in Toronto, and I've grown up there my whole life. I was in Slut or Nut that one time. I talked about the cost of being sexually assaulted by a coworker. I used to work for the federal government of Canada in the public service, and a coworker sexually assaulted me, and I've been kind of pursuing administrative justice through that avenue. And from there, I've kind of become an activist. I am a board member at the Toronto Rape Crisis Centre, Multicultural Women Against Rape, and I am also a journalist. So my life is kind of anti-rape activism. And that's been a huge, huge, huge part of my recovery process as a survivor of sexual violence.
Would you be, before we get into the activism, would you be comfortable talking a little bit more about what exactly happened in your case? Or I shouldn't even say your case, but what exactly happened and what was your experience with being sexually assaulted?
Basically, it was my first job out of undergrad, and I had just gotten a very, it's called a casual contract with the federal government, where you just work there for 90 days. So it was super precarious work. I wasn't unionized, and I didn't even get any health benefits from it or anything. But this coworker who was senior to me sexually assaulted me in the backseat of his car while he drove me home from work. We met through the office through a mutual friend who also worked in the office. And, the within the first couple of days of the sexual assault, I was just kind of like, I don't want to go through the criminal justice system because I know what happens to people who go through the criminal justice system, because it's super hostile against survivors and victims, especially when it comes to sexual violence. But when your bodily like autonomy is violated in such a way, survivors often develop PTSD, and that's what was happening to me. And having to see him in the workplace, laughing with, other people in the office, it just really got to me. And having, the first day I went back to work after the assault, he came up to my desk like from behind and like shook my chair. And yeah. And I was just like, oh my God, I don't want to have to see him ever again, because, I would stop breathing and I would just freeze up when I saw him. And, when your sense of safety is just completely shattered like that, you don't know what to do. So as much as I didn't want to go through the criminal justice system, as much as I didn't want to tell anybody what had happened, I knew that I couldn't like get back in the car with him. I couldn't keep accepting rides from him. I couldn't, I didn't want to work with him. So I ended up going to management and they called the cops for me. And I was like, okay, that's great, but whatever. And, I was under the assumption that they would do everything in their power to protect me. And that ended up not being the case at all. I was the one who was essentially punished for what had happened. Because they called the cops. He obviously, like, with the police had to come to the office and like take my statement and everything. So he knew that I I reported him to management. And he and that mutual friend of ours went on Twitter and they called me a crazy bitch. They called me a false victim. They were like tweeting about it during work hours, and it was just really fucked up. And when I told management that they were tweeting about me, they were like, this is just a personal matter. Sorry, we can't deal with it. We have to remain neutral and fair to all parties involved.
Was the person who assaulted you, was he on a peer level, or was he somebody in a supervised, like how much power did he have within the company to kind of sway forces in his direction? Or did you feel like you were, at least in the beginning, getting heard out by management, or was that part of the fear?
He wasn't a supervisor really, but he was like the team support person. So he was supposed to do my training. I think he was like on a longer term contract, and he had been at that office already for 2 to 3 years. So it's not like he had direct power over me, but certainly he had more seniority, more tenure, and like mattered more to the government than I did. And it's just like, this, they didn't want to deal with it because it happened after work, and it happened around the corner from my house. So technically, it wasn't like it happened at work and they weren't responsible for it. But, the trauma doesn't give a shit about, where it happens. Like, it's still going to affect an employee sexually assaulting another employee is still going to affect the work environment. Like, it's extremely like naive and just kind of morally weak to be like, well, we're not going to deal with it because he, found this loophole and he sexually assaulted you outside of the office.
It's terrible. And so, okay, so they started basically tweeting to defame your character, which is a common defense that people employ as soon as they're accused. And then what kind of happened next?
So he was charged with sexual assault by the police. And to accommodate his bail restrictions, they wanted to minimize the chances of us running into each other at work. So they took me, like, we were on the night shift when this happened. And when you're working outside of normal business hours, you get an extra $2 an hour. It's called the shift premium. And they made me go back onto the day shift, and they made me sit on a different floor from the rest of my team, to make sure that we didn't run into each other. And that was to accommodate, the bail restrictions that he had because he sexually assaulted me. And no, he wasn't punished at all. You know, like we're public servants, like we're government employees, and part of the conditions of our employment is signing this like values and ethics code that is based on like a respect for people. And sexually assaulting someone is like it's objectively a violation of that value. So regardless of where it happened, he should have been fired, or at least some sort of investigation. The harassment complaint process should have been triggered at that moment when I said, this guy sexually assaulted me.
And so instead of like doing their own internal harassment complaint with like HR, which would have led to him being fired, they just rolled it over straight to the police, and their justification was that it happened outside of the work environment.
Yep.
And when you went to them, was your hope that, like, what was your hope when you went to them? What did you want them to do?
I just wanted to not have to feel like I didn't want to have to deal with the flashbacks. I just didn't want to hear his voice. I didn't want to see him. I didn't really care at the time about holding him accountable. I just wanted to get the fuck away from him. I just wanted to reestablish my sense of safety. That was my priority. For the 2 weeks between the assault and me coming forward to management, I would leave the office at like midnight. That was when our shift ended. And I was coming from Mississauga. So I'd have to commute from Mississauga to Scarborough, which is like an hour and a half commute. And it was, minus 40 degrees Celsius with the wind chill. And I was so scared every night that, he would try to come up to me, or like he would run me over with his car, or our friend would, harass me. So it just didn't feel safe. Like I did not feel safe in that environment at all. And that was my hope in coming forward to management, that they would protect me, that they would support me, that I could keep working there and, just move past this. But because they called the cops, that kind of ruined everything. Not ruined, but that kind of made everything go in a direction that I didn't want it to go.
No, I mean, I totally understand. Like, I asked those questions because I want to get at how you were feeling in that time period.
I was feeling traumatized. Like, I remember my supervisor saying, like, I'm gonna move your workstation to like where I'm sitting. And I'm like, yeah, I can deal with that. Like, as long as I'm not in an isolated environment with him, or, that someone has my back kind of thing.
Yeah, it has such like a tone of Gomeshi too, like coming up behind you and shaking your chair. I'm pretty sure in the Jian Gomeshi case, somebody literally talked about that exact same kind of intimidation tactic.
Yeah.
Or like standing over your desk, this type of stuff that men in workplace power positions, or even just in the workplace, do to kind of intimidate young women.
Yeah.
And so once it became obvious that they weren't going to fire him, that like the police had kind of set a snowball rolling down a hill, did you think about quitting, or what was going through your mind at that point? What did you decide to do at that point?
Well, my contract was for 90 working days, and this happened, I think, halfway through those 90 days. So I was like, you know what, just push forward, get the experience, do a good job, and try to get, a better use the experience to get a better contract somewhere else.
Right. Because a federal contract is a great position for somebody fresh out of university.
Absolutely. And even though, it was just a very like temporary and casual contract, I was like, this, like, just having that on my resume will get me in somewhere. And, by the time everything settled and, I started going to counseling and everything, And also being on the day shift away from him kind of made things feel a bit better. Um, and the pay was decent enough. Like I was being paid $20 an hour for data entry. It was interesting because, I get to see all of these like immigration applications and stuff, and I get to see how that stuff works. They launched a competition where it was very tailored to our experience, and I knocked it out of the park. Like I did my job really well. Like I met all my statistics, and like I was a high performing employee despite what I was going through. And I ended up being successful in that competition. And by the time it was August, there was a job offer from that office. And I was like, okay, well, I have a student loan to pay off. I have credit card debt to pay off. I have, a family to support. I should take this job. And I was under the impression that he was no longer at that office when I accepted the offer because that mutual friend who, called me a crazy bitch and, false victim or whatever, we had kind of reconciled. Not really.
Oh my gosh, that would take a lot to reconcile.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what I was thinking, but we'd been friends for a couple of years when that happened, and I was like, okay, I'll see how. Like she ended up apologizing to me, and I was just kind of like, okay, let's see how this goes. And I asked her, I was like, hey, is what's his face still at the office? She was like, let me check. No, he's not, or something like that.
And
So
are we allowed to say what's his face's name? Like, did the publication ban happen, or is there?
So the funny thing is, I argued for the publication ban at the Criminal Injuries Board to be lifted because I didn't need it. I didn't want it. And he argued to stay under the publication ban. But he was never under the publication ban in the first place.
Well, but he didn't want you to talk about it.
Yeah.
Because he was afraid you'd like publicly talk about him, probably.
Yeah, exactly. And the funny thing is that not usually the alleged offenders, as the criminal injuries refers to them, they don't go to those hearings. But he was so obsessed with protecting his reputation that he went and argued. And his lawyer was like, well, if you guys find that Miss Talusen is a victim of a sexual assault, then you're finding my client to be a rapist. And then they found me to be a victim of a sexual assault.
And we should probably back up because I know some people listening won't be familiar with these different court processes. So,
yeah.
So you've accepted a job back there. You go back and realize he's still there.
Yeah.
And I guess the cops have laid charges. So
yeah.
You guys are basically still functioning in this work environment.
So the charge, like the criminal process was still proceeding, I guess, because of his bail restrictions. Like he couldn't come within 100 feet of my home. He couldn't, contact me indirectly or directly. So I got back to the office, and I think within a couple of days of me starting there, I ran into him in the lunchroom, and I basically lost my shit. I had a total panic attack. I was having lunch with a couple of coworkers, and then I just had to get up and run out of the room without any, notice or what was going on. And I knew that I could not work I could not be in a work environment where he was, obviously.
Yeah.
And then that same day, I got a call from my victim witness protection worker, and she was like, yeah, we're withdrawing the charge.
Oh, whoa.
Yeah. We're withdrawing the charge because he went through a diversionary course. So in exchange for the charge in exchange for withdrawing the charge, he completed counseling on sexually transmitted infections.
What? How is this a thing?
Right?
Okay, this is the first time I'm hearing about this. So is this a common thing, diversionary courses?
I don't know. Like when I met with the Crown in the summer, just before I went back to working there, I was like, I don't necessarily need him to go to jail. I just want him to know that what he did was really wrong and he shouldn't do it again. And they were like, okay, we can make sure that he goes through, counseling or whatever. And I was fine with that.
You were probably thinking it was going to be like counseling against violence against women or like counseling against being a sexual predator, and it turned out to be
Yeah.
infectious diseases.
Yeah, which is not the point. I wanted him to learn about consent because clearly he knew nothing about consent. But instead he went for STIs.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And so what were you feeling at that time?
After I left that meeting with the Crown where I said, I don't think I need him to go to jail, I said that out of a place of fear. Kind of like, I don't want to go through the trial process. I don't want to, go through all of this only to learn that, he wasn't convicted or whatever. And I also know that the prison system isn't really cut out for rehabilitation. And I didn't want to make, whatever was wrong with him worse. So here I am thinking like, yeah, I'm a good person for, showing him compassion and mercy or whatever. But then I kind of thought about it and was like, no, I could go to trial. Like, I think what happened, like, I think that there's enough evidence for him to be convicted or whatever. And I emailed my caseworker like right after that meeting and was like, yeah, I think we should just proceed to trial if the Crown is willing to do that. I think I'm like confident in that. But it was too late. They had already made up their mind that they were going to withdraw the charge and whatever. So when I got that call saying that they were actually going to withdraw the charge, I was really disappointed. I wasn't really thinking about my safety at the time. And, knowing it was like I definitely cried a lot when I got that call. And by that time I had also already met with my managers who had said that like I told them in good faith that the charge was going to be withdrawn. I wanted to keep them in the loop, I guess. And when I told them that, they were like, okay, well, if that's the case, we're going to normalize your working conditions and we're going to move you down to the 3rd floor, which is also where he was seated.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, no, that's not okay. Like, I have PTSD from this guy sexually assaulting me. Like, I don't want to work within 100 feet of him. Like, no, thank you. Is there any way that I could stay up on, the upper floor? Or if that's not possible, I'd like to be transferred out of this office, please and thank you. So just knowing that I had to deal with that when the charge was withdrawn, I did not feel good.
Yeah. It's people can't even understand the mental fatigue involved because I also had a situation where my workplace got involved. I wasn't sexually assaulted, but I was physically assaulted in my workplace. Got involved with that physical assault and turned it over to law enforcement. And I felt as well, I won't go into it here, but I also felt like I was being punished. I felt like I was such a leper in the office, just a pariah, but I couldn't leave because I'd already been trained. I would have literally had to pay back my training. That was their policy if you quit before the tour was over. So it was extremely stressful, and I can't even imagine. And I was in like further along than you were, and I can't even imagine having to deal with that in like a first job situation. It's just so much mental fatigue and anxiety, and I'm just so sorry that you had to go through that.
Thank you. It was really isolating. Like I remember going back to work after I after I reported the assault and, after the schedule switch had happened, I was like, does everybody know? Like, I was walking around the office thinking like, oh my God, I felt like I was walking around with like a scarlet letter. Even though I knew that wasn't the case. It's just, when something traumatic happens to you, um, your sense of fear is like heightened, like everything feels unsafe. And that's such a common response in, with sexual violence. It might be not like it might be like it might seem irrational to other people, feeling like, everybody knows, or that, your assailant's gonna hit you with his car. But it feels like like in the moment, it
No,
feels like
it's
a very
scary.
valid response.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so scary. And the everybody knows part also really got to me. Like, I know, like
Yeah.
there were a couple times where like wives of coworkers would come up and they wouldn't say anything, but they'd be kind of like extra nice, and which I appreciated, but inside I was like, oh my God, everybody's talking about me. Like
Yeah.
everybody knows, like these women know and they don't even work here, and they just like are pitying me, and like nobody, I have no privacy here. Like everybody's gossiping about me
Yeah.
nonstop was the feeling that
Exactly.
I got consumed with.
Yeah.
Um, and so at this point, with the criminal trial no longer happening, is this when you decided to go to the compensation board, the
The
criminal board?
compensation for criminal injuries, or
Yeah.
criminal injuries compensation board,
This
whatever.
it's CIBC, isn't it? It's Criminal Injuries CICB,
Compensation board.
Criminal Injury Compensation Board, which is called different things in different places.
Yeah.
But that is what it is called in Ontario. In the
Yeah.
United States, we call it like I think it's called the Victim Fund.
Yep.
So, okay. So is that when you decided to go forward with reporting him?
I actually filed my application for the criminal injuries board when my first contract ended. I was like, okay, well, I have nothing to do now, so I might as well do this. But they wanted to wait. They wanted to wait. They wanted to wait for the criminal process to wrap up before they proceeded with that application. So I wrote to them like in October 2015 and was like, hey, just so you know, the criminal process wrapped up. Can we proceed with this? Blah, blah, blah. And they scheduled a hearing for January 2016.
Okay. And so what happened after that? Like, you want to take us through what's kind of going on now? Well, and also I should say, like, how long did you keep working there, and what did you do to kind of help you move on? Because eventually, by the time I met you, you seemed very strong, very confident activist.
Glad. Thank you.
How did you kind of move on from this whole experience, and what did you do to help yourself recover from that PTSD?
So I decided to fight. I, on my second contract, I was actually unionized, so I had the support of my union. My union rep was like, he actually called my manager and was like, you can't make this girl work with someone who assaulted her. Like, they might not be on the same team, but like, you can't put her within 100 feet of him. Like, that's just like unjust. It's like, it's not right. And obviously she's like already disclosed that she has PTSD from, the sexual assault. So, you're discriminating against her, blah, 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 that kind of stuff. And my counselor from Women's College also called my manager to say, please don't do this. So the way that my union and I approached this was requesting they're kind of going for their duty to accommodate for mental disability, because that's you have, like, we all have a right to work in a workplace that's safe.
Right. And that's easier. That's easier for people to swallow than taking any kind of steps to prevent sexual assault or sexual harassment in the workplace, apparently.
You would think. Um, you would you would think and you would hope, but it's they like just couldn't separate the two. The way management was looking at it was like, well, if we accommodate her, then we're saying that we believe her, and if we believe her, that means we think that this guy sexually assaulted her, and if we do anything to help her, he's gonna come and sue us,
Right.
which is bullshit. Um,
And did you ever think of suing him at any point in this process? Like, did you ever think about taking it to a civil court?
I considered it, but I knew from, the time, like before the assault, like I knew that he was borrowing money from, our mutual friend and stuff. I knew you can't bleed a dry rock, or you can't bleed a rock or something like that. So I was like, forget it. Like, I'm not going to get anything out of him. I may as well just go through the system because I have no other choice. And I've already lost so much, in the aftermath of the assault. Yeah, so I, went to my doctor and got, a formal recommendation to be just transferred out of the office because they really did not want to, move me to a different team or anything like that. Which is actually really unreasonable. It's like I filed like an access to information request under the Privacy Act. And that means, because I'm a government employee, I'm entitled to all information that that the government has on me. So I got all of the emails between my managers, like kind of talking about their decision and stuff to keep me within 100 feet of this guy. And my director was saying like, well, this is just an interpersonal matter, and this doesn't involve us, and it creates extra work for us. And she compared, me being sexually assaulted by a coworker to a divorced couple in the workplace. Yeah, they were really stubborn and just hostile towards me, requesting accommodation for PTSD. And they were hostile towards me for reporting it in the first place.
And I'm sort of amazed that they even like kept you on. I'm sure it was just for legal, like probably because, well, and you were well performing, but I feel like
Yeah.
some companies would just drop you immediately at that kind
Yeah.
of stuff if they could.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the Freedom of Information access request, like because
Yeah.
I also filed one after years later after my incident with
Yeah.
my workplace getting law enforcement involved, when I was assaulted. And when it came, I couldn't even open the envelope. Like, I think it took me
Yeah.
another year for me to even want to look at what was inside that envelope because I was so apprehensive about like reliving the experience through those documents, but also apprehensive
Yeah.
about just like the anger that I might feel towards the government. So I was also a federal employee at that time, so the anger that I might feel
Yeah.
reading. So I wonder, like, how was that for you? Like, what was that experience like for you when you got those documents?
I mean, this ended up not being my only access to information request. And at the time, like I was still in a place where I could do it. Like I remember just immediately like opening the CD and like just popping it into my laptop and like going through
Mm-hmm.
the documents and going like, oh my God, like people actually put all this shit in like writing.
Yeah.
That's what was astounding to me. It's that these people thought that they were so right, that what they were doing was perfectly justified.
Oh, yes.
Um,
Like, as in,
and
to be like, they just will move floors and it'll be fine to move them back once the charges are dropped. And
right? Yeah. So that access to information request was like that kind of boosted my confidence, I guess, in wanting to pursue this through the internal department mechanism. Um, so after sorry, where was I?
yeah.
Da-da-da. So I ended up working at that office for 6 weeks. Or, sorry, I ended up working at that office from September to November, so that's 2 months.
And this is
For
the
six,
second office. Like
no,
the
this is the first office still. This is on the
Okay,
second
all right.
contract though. So this is for 6 weeks. I had to work in an environment where I knew that the guy who assaulted me was, just down the hall, and I completely isolated myself. Like he was, part of the Occupational Health and Safety Committee, which was ironic to me because they were running like mental health campaigns. Um, he was also, I think he was like he was part of the union, like he was a representative, and I just did not feel safe, like just having any friends in the office or like socializing or anything because I knew that I could run into him at any time. I knew that he could just pop into like a conversation that I was having with someone. And I remember a couple of my coworkers inviting me out for drinks, and I was so down to go, like, because they were part of the cohort that I was hired with, and I was really down to go. But that day, I ended up feeling too sick from the anxiety. Like for those 6 weeks, like I had trouble sleeping, and like I had a 40-minute commute like across town in the mornings. Um, my appetite was like really disordered. I was just running on adrenaline on all the time, and it just
Yeah.
wasn't good for my body. And
How is your sleeping?
barely there, like non-existent almost.
Yeah. I had that same issue.
Yeah, and so they were inviting me out for drinks, and then I ended up canceling last minute. And it just didn't feel fair to me that that was happening. I was like, I shouldn't be the one isolating myself from people. I shouldn't be the one, looking around corners and like checking, windows to see his reflection if he's there or not. This wasn't my fault. So I texted that coworker. I was like, "Hey, I have something to tell you." And like like I just needed to tell someone at that office what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so I told her, and I didn't name names or anything, but she was like, "Oh my God, is it that guy from, like on," like she said what his team was. I was like, "Yeah, that's him. Why?" And she was like, "Because first of all, he showed up like completely uninvited to drinks tonight. And second of all, like we've all been getting creepy vibes off of him."
Oh
And
my
I was like,
God.
"Oh, wow." Wow. So I started like going out for lunch with them, like to this other office building like across the street, and that made things better. Like being able to like talk to people and socialize, it just made me feel a bit more safe.
Mm-hmm.
And going out with people outside of the office, minimizing the chances that he'd be there or something, and that these people knew that he assaulted me.
Yeah.
Just that feeling, like it helped so much. Kind of having like a small community around me. And they ended up going to their supervisor and saying like, "Hey, we know that this happened to Rosalyn, and something has to be done because we don't feel safe in the work environment anymore."
Yeah.
And management just didn't know what to do with it. They were like, "Why is she talking? Like, why is she telling people what happened to her? What are we supposed to do? Blah, 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 blah." And they went to their supervisor the same day that I ended up being transferred out.
Oh, wow.
I made it happen that way. Because I was like, well, I don't want management to like come after me or whatever. But it's, as much as, I needed to, apparently I needed to protect his privacy or something.
Right. His reputation.
Right. And it's like, but he sexually assaulted someone. Why, like, you can't expect me to respect his privacy when he violated mine. That doesn't make sense. And management actually called me a few weeks after I was transferred out of that office, and they were like, "You can't talk about this in the workplace to anybody, or else it will be construed as harassing him."
Oh my God.
And I was like, "Oh wow, so you can threatened disciplinary action against me, but not him for sexually assaulting me. That doesn't make sense. So that's when I was like, okay, well, this, like, something is deeply wrong here.
Yeah.
And that's when I filed my human rights complaint, and because of the human rights complaint, I ended up filing like an internal harassment complaint against my managers for making me work with him, and against him for sexually assaulting me, and then going on Twitter about it.
Good for you.
Thanks.
I probably would have been like, fuck you, I quit. And then like ran off and cried. So that's good that you actually did stuff.
I really wanted to do that, but, as someone, like, it just felt like my responsibility almost.
Yeah.
To speak up and say something. And, if they're doing this to me, how many other people have they done this to?
Yeah.
And that was my rationale for feeling okay going to the police and stuff. It's, I don't want this guy to do it again. I don't want these managers to
act like this.
Yeah, exactly.
My favorite comment when I finally did read the information request was one of my supervisors wrote. This was like in the 24 hours after I had been violently assaulted. The supervisor wrote, "She seems really depressed. I think something's wrong with her."
No
and
shit.
I'm like, no shit. And then they're like, maybe she needs to leave and go for counseling. Like, leave her job and go for counseling. And I'm like, no shit, something's wrong with me. I just got violently assaulted.
Yeah, it's
I'm
like
upset. It's like so crazy how people interpret these kind of events, and for them it's like an administrative hassle, and for you, you're in like a whirlwind of like mental turmoil.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell us, like, can you? I know it's so crazy. Can you explain what the human rights complaint was and how that worked out?
The human rights complaint is still, the human rights complaint is still,
or like what that is, I guess, for people they might not know who are listening.
So, because of like, the body's called the Canada Human Rights Commission, or the Canada Human Rights Tribunal, and they basically deal with any federally regulated workplaces, and they protect your human rights in those workplaces. So the reason I filed that complaint was because, I had been sexually assaulted, which is, discrimination and harassment based on sex. And I had been discriminated against by my managers for having PTSD and not being able to function in the workplace because of that PTSD. So it's kind of like it was a two-pronged complaint.
Mm-hmm.
That dealt with me facing barriers at work because of my sex and because of my mental disability.
Yes.
And, as much as, like, I was able to, like, at the time, I can no longer do this, but at the time I was able to kind of set my emotions aside and set my emotions aside and kind of just work through it. But that's not how the workplace should be.
Yeah, you were in like go mode.
Yeah, adrenaline.
Yeah.
And that was like extremely taxing on my body and on my mind. And that's something not every employee faces. So obviously that's a case of discrimination right there. Like I was going through something extraordinary, basically.
And what people don't understand is that level of adrenaline will like generate more PTSD in and of itself, because your whole body is so out of balance and you're in stress mode all the time. You've got cortisol going all the time. Yep. It just wears you out and leaves you in this extremely fragmented and fragile state.
Yep. Management reacting that way and just kind of, refusing, the way that they treated me, it was like they didn't believe that I had been assaulted. It was either that they didn't believe that it happened, or they believed that it wasn't bad enough to warrant any of their assistance. And those two reactions are hostile. Those two reactions were further traumatic. And, exposing me to someone who assaulted me, that's being exposed to a traumatic reminder. So it's literally like, obviously working with your rapist is triggering. It just boggled my mind that they didn't understand that.
It's like no little thing too. Like people don't understand what it is like to be raped.
Yeah,
It's fucking terrible. Sorry,
it really is.
excuse my French, but it's terrible. And it's not some little thing that can get swept under the rug. It's something that you need to have the person punished for, or
Yeah,
it's an awful, terrible ordeal. And we all need to, not you and I, but society needs to take it more serious, and
absolutely.
workplaces
Yeah.
need to take it a lot more serious than they do, because it just destroys a person's life.
Yeah. And what's also just surprising is, they knew how bad it was. They knew that me coming forward about a coworker sexually assaulting me was bad enough for them to call the cops. So they understand how bad it was. They just didn't want to do the work it took to, deal with this properly. Which it's just really sad that, when it comes to sexual assault, when it comes to, any kind of violence, it's easier for bystanders to do nothing. And by doing nothing, you're siding with the perpetrator. So I filed the human rights complaint. I filed the internal harassment complaint, which I think ended up being like 3,000 words. It wasn't resolved, like it wasn't finalized until November 2017. So that was almost 2 years of my life gone. The department, so the way the internal harassment complaint works is, you write this formal letter of complaint, and then you send it to someone in senior management called the delegated official on, the harassment policy or something like that. And so this senior manager went through my harassment complaint and kind of screened in the allegations that were acceptable under the policy. They screened in 3 allegations, which ended up being, the first one was he posted on social media with a work colleague, derogatory comments about me. He came up to this was after the criminal charges were withdrawn and just before I was about to be transferred out to a different office. He came up to my desk and smiled at me. And, while that in itself, like, alone isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's, this guy's assaulted me. Given the context, like, why would you be coming up to me and smiling at me? And first of all, like, why are you coming up to the supply cabinet outside of my desk when you sit, 100 feet away from me and there's a supply cabinet right there for you?
Yeah, it's called intimidation.
Exactly. Or, he's mocking me, something like that. And then the third allegation that they found to be harassment was that management made me work within 100 feet of him despite disclosing my PTSD to them. So those 3 things met the department's policy on harassment. And then from there, they hired a third-party law firm to formally investigate the allegations and stuff. So that I interviewed with this law firm, I guess, in July 2016. And it took about 4 hours just to kind of talk through everything. Oh, and the department, again, didn't want to deal with the sexual assault because it happened off-site and off hours. So that couldn't be dealt with through the harassment complaint. And it was confusing to me at first because I was like, okay, well, if you're not going to deal with the sexual assault, then how can you deal with these other 3 allegations? But I guess it kind of worked out in my favor because they assumed, like, the assumption is that the sexual assault happened.
Right.
And, given that I had gone to the police, I went to a hospital and sought treatment from them. That stuff weighed in my favor, obviously. So in July 2016, I spent 4 hours out of my day talking to a lawyer and kind of going through everything. And then in March 2017, I got the preliminary report, which kind of gathered all the evidence and, summarized it and whatever. The way that worked out, I ended up getting like 3 giant stacks of paper in the mail. Because, the harassment complaint was against 2 managers and my rapist. So they gave me like a week to reply to to make any comments and like formulate a response to the preliminary report. And I was like, that's not enough time to go through 3 different, thick documents. And I ended up, I can't remember how many words I wrote in those responses, but basically I was like, basically the harassment complaint was like an extra full-time job on top of my normal full-time job. I ended up being transferred to the office where his ex or current girlfriend worked. So I was, and she knew who I was. Like before the assault, like we had met, and I kind of think that he was using me as kind of like oh, we should get back together. Like, look at this like hot young thing. Like he was using me to make her jealous, I think.
What a gem this guy was.
Right. And, I also, like, when I was working at that second office, when I had been transferred out, I saw his car in the parking lot and I freaked out. Like, that's the site of my assault.
Yeah. The car.
So it was like, yeah, walking into the office, like, and seeing that, I was just like, fuck, like, what? And this was after I'd been transferred out. And I was just like, fuck it. Like, is he here? Am I going to have to see him today? Is he at this office? And I like went to my manager who knew nothing about anything at the time. And I was like, are there any people from like, this office here today? And she was like, oh my God, let me check. I don't think so. Yeah. Well, she I guess she knew because she had received my harassment complaint. But yeah, just knowing that someone at that office knew who I was and obviously didn't like me. And having to see, the site of my assault, it just ended up not being as healthy of an environment as I would have liked it to. So I ended up taking an assignment at an outside office or at an outside department. So effectively, I was kind of forced out of my career with that department altogether.
Yeah. It's, wow. Okay, so you were going to counseling. What were you doing during this time to kind of take care of yourself, or were you taking care of yourself?
I've always, actually, since like 2014, I've been practicing hot yoga, and that was really saving my life at the time. It was like getting rid of, the extra muscle tension I had from like all the adrenaline. It was a really good way of like just taking care of my physical body and learning how to meditate and being like, it was such a like helpful tool in being able to kind of mitigate the symptoms of trauma. And, I had a wonderful counselor at Women's College Hospital. And she was, giving me our work focused on, narrative therapy. So storytelling, and storytelling is such a huge part of recovering from trauma. And from the storytelling part, like, I became a writer. I started writing for online publications. And I'm still on medication for my PTSD, which is, what's it called again? Cipralex, escitalopram, Lexapro, which has just kind of helped me rebalance my, brain chemicals.
Okay, and that's an antidepressant generally, correct?
Yeah.
And then, so narrative therapy, I've actually never met anybody that's done that, but I always thought it was such a good idea. So is it like, not to get into how yours worked personally, but just is it like you're writing stories or just telling the stories out loud, or like, what's the approach? for people that might be interested in looking at that for
Yeah,
themselves?
it's just an approach, like it's just, I guess, a method of therapy. It's I was just reading about this in this book called Trauma and Recovery by Dr. Judith Herman. It's just kind of being able to, in the documentary, how the that illustration that Kid does
Mm-hmm.
with the folder and like,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
So
That's in the Slut or Nut documentary.
yes. um Being like kind of talking through your trauma and reframing it in a way, like reframing it as a narrative and kind of forming it into a story, it helps your brain process it. So it helps your brain kind of like put that memory into the appropriate folder. Because the way, like when trauma happens, it's like a frozen moment in time.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to talk through it, and kind of speaking power to the truth, being able to do that just kind of helps you process it better.
Giving it like a beginning, middle, and end type
Yeah,
of thing, and then you can kind of file it away in the trauma folder, and your brain can integrate it into your
consciousness. Yeah,
consciousness.
yeah,
Interesting. Okay, and so I'm glad that you're able to access that counseling too, because I
yeah. Me
know there
too.
are like long waits for people sometimes to be able to access publicly funded
Yeah,
counseling, and it's expensive to go private. So I'm glad you were able to access that. I'm going to include the link to that book too when I release this, and
yes, please.
links to any writing that you've done that viewers might be interested to read. Now, bring us up to, because we talked for a long time and I don't want to take your whole day up, but bring us up to where things are right now.
Okay, so right now, I have 2 human rights complaints. I have 3 union grievances. I have a claim before the WSIB, so our Workers' Compensation Board. I have a complaint before the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner, and I'm about to file a complaint with the labor program. So my full-time job has essentially become auditing the harassment complaint procedures in the public service. It's unofficial. It's kind of just what I've been forced to do as a result of all of this. Because what ended up happening with the harassment complaint, the investigator found that I had been harassed as per, the department policies. So yes, I was harassed because my coworker posted derogatory comments on me on social media. Yes, I was harassed by my managers because they made me work with him for 6 weeks despite disclosing my mental disability. Despite those being founded allegations, the department ended up saying, well, we're not going to do anything because, ultimately you were accommodated, you were transferred out of the office. So we don't agree that that's harassment. So my union wasn't happy with that, and we ended up filing a grievance over that. Because, those managers should have been held accountable. Because what they did was not okay. And because of that grievance, obviously that added to my stress. And at the time, I was already going through a lot of my own personal stuff. I had just left an abusive relationship. My mom was in the hospital for a stem cell transplant. Yeah. And, while I was on an acting assignment outside of the original department, they stopped paying me properly for 8 months. So I was under a lot of financial stress. Like, obviously, I was still being paid, but I wasn't being paid for what I was hired to do. Like, I wasn't being paid in full. And there was so much stress in my life that I just ended up having a psychological breakdown in the workplace. And, that psychological stress was mainly caused by my employer, that, um, all of the harassment complaint stuff, all of the pay stuff impacted my ability to cope with leaving an abusive relationship. It impacted my ability to cope with, my mom being in the hospital. So I ended up being forced onto sick leave because I filed a workers' compensation claim where I said that I was experiencing suicidal ideation, which I've experienced before and, survived. But I knew that because I was experiencing those symptoms, that I needed help, that I needed to be away from the workplace, that, I needed to kind of, take care of my health. And because I filed that workers' compensation claim, my managers at the time were like, okay, well, we don't think that you're fit to come to work anymore. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't have any sick leave because, I've been dealing with this stress for so long that I've exhausted it. And I haven't been paid properly, for almost a year at that time. And, I can't afford to go on unpaid leave. So like, please don't force me onto sick leave. But they were like, well, whatever, this is our duty, blah, 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 blah. They sent me to a psychiatrist who further harassed me. And I refused to go back to work. Like, that psychiatrist was there to say, this person is okay to return to the workplace, blah, blah, blah. But a month had elapsed by the time I saw her. And by then I was like, you know what, I'm already on unpaid leave. Like, I may as well keep doing it. Like, I may as well stay on unpaid leave if this is going to be the work environment that I'm going back to. And because I'm a writer, because I speak publicly about what I've been going through, my managers were like, well, like they ended up finding my Twitter and, discovering that I had gone public about my situation with them. And they were like, okay, well, if you don't stop posting about this, if you don't cease and desist, we're not going to renew your contract. And I was like, this was in February 2018. And I'm like, we just had the Me Too movement come back up. We've just had all of these like commitments from our federal government to say, we're not going to tolerate harassment in federal workplaces. I felt not entitled, but like I had like a responsibility to share my story.
Yeah. And it's even like people have to remember you were doing all this way before Me Too. It was actually so much harder to come forward or to make any kind of report because it was, I don't know, even like less, you're even more of a pariah than you are, I think, now that we've kind of gotten used to not used to, but more used to women coming forward.
Yeah, exactly. And, like by the time I had gone to that department, like this would have been my third department, I was already on TV, like because of Mandi's demonstration. Like I was already like we were on CBC, and I remember my supervisor telling me like, oh, I saw you on TV, like I think what you do is amazing. But then a year later, she's like, well, you need to stop talking about the public service on social media or else we're going to fire you. And so they fired me. And now that's why I have, another human rights complaint. That's why I have, another grievance. Literally, I just tweeted, like, I have a whole thread about what I just talked about to you. Saying like, the public service has completely failed me as a survivor of sexual violence. My managers have obviously not had the proper training to be able to deal with this stuff. And, like, it's not like I was saying like Justin Trudeau's a Nazi or like whatever. I was reporting what was happening to me. I was making it public. And, like at the time I had just looked at, or I had just written to Trudeau saying like, or I had just written to Trudeau about what I was going through, and I made that letter that I wrote him public. And it's like, if the government's going to say this, like it was in direct response to the to Harvey Weinstein and like all of those reports coming out, the government was like, we're not going to tolerate this stuff. So they introduced Bill C-65, which kind of strengthens the Canada Labor Code when it comes to sexual harassment and violence in the workplace. And I was like, okay, if you guys are, if the government's going to, reaffirm their commitment as like a feminist government to deal with this stuff, they should be dealing with, my grievance, my harassment complaint, whatever, with the same kind of attitude that they're saying that they have. But instead of that, they're threatening, like my managers are threatening to fire me. Like there's a huge discrepancy between what the government is saying and what public service managers are doing. And like, I'm not the only one going through this. Like I've spoken to, the union knows that I'm not the only one dealing with this. But I don't know. I feel like I've kind of I'm kind of like, like neck deep in this stuff. So it's too late for me to back out. Like I've already lost so much. Like I haven't been working since November 2017. And because of what my managers have done to me, essentially like firing me for using my voice, it's like I've been too scared to write. Me coming on this podcast is kind of my my way of trying to get my voice back, I guess. Yeah. Um Whatever. I like yeah, like I given the fact that like I know that this like I'm not the only one going through this, like I think it's more important than ever for me to speak out. Especially in like a public, like especially being in a public institution. Like this is taxpayer money being used to fight against me. Like I just want to resolve this as soon as possible. That's been my end goal. Because I know that the government says that they're committed to dealing with sexual violence and harassment in the workplace appropriately. Exactly. And I have faith that they're going to do that. It's just a matter of what.
And it sucks that it's such a long and drawn out process. I think that's what people don't realize. Like, somebody might be listening to this and they might think, oh my God, she's got so many cases going on. She's been doing it for so many years. She must be like a professional victim. No, they don't realize that, like, this is a process for everyone. Like, government administrative reviews take 2 years just for them to review your documents, just for them to, like, decide what kind of process the case is even going to go through. This stuff takes an incredibly insane amount of time. It's inefficient. There's all this stuff you have to do. It's incredibly time consuming. And that's why I think it is so easy for people to just be like, fuck it. I can't, I have to just like quit and like move on, because which is not how it should be. It should be much easier, and the focus should be on investigating the perpetrator, not trying to kind of like protect the perpetrator from potential investigation or like so it's so unfortunate how draining and time consuming even just trying to get a shred of justice is in the bureaucratic government systems that we currently have.
Absolutely. And I don't want to believe that people would rather their tax money go to protecting someone who was found to have sexually assaulted a colleague. Like I don't know where he is now. I don't know where those managers are now. But the level of like gross mismanagement and just like incompetence is just astounding. In the book that I mentioned, Trauma and Recovery, it's when you come forward about a sexual assault, the victim kind of like, you're asking people to share the burden of your pain, and people don't want to do that, and that's something that needs to change.
I agree. I think that's a great note to end on.
Yeah.
But is there anything else that you want to add?
I don't think so.
Well, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. And
Of course.
I hope this is only the beginning of you taking your voice back. And I look forward to hearing more from you and reading more from you and getting an update on how all of this goes.
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
We don't often think about the financial costs of rape, but losing your job, having to move, being off work from being sick, taking sick leave, taking annual leave to recover from a trauma, taking leave from work to attend court cases, taking leave from work to testify in your own trial, taking leave to have to meet with lawyers, paying lawyers, using your productivity hours to seek justice for yourself. These are all some of the costs of rape that we don't think about. And I've included in our show notes some more resources on this topic. And you can read about the demonstration we discussed in this podcast called Rapenomics as well on our website. And it's also featured in the documentary Slut, Not the Diary of a Rape Trial, which, as I am happy to announce in the beginning, is going to be released on February 19th of this year on worldwide. So it'll be available to stream, rent, download. Thank you so much, and please remember, if someone discloses a sexual assault to you, please listen and support them.